OTB in 10, fantasy banter in 10 minutes or less. And even though we could start with injuries again this week, we will shift gears and we'll talk a little bit about the state of quarterbacks. Garcia, as we look at the landscape through 2 weeks, there are 12 quarterbacks averaging 20 or more fantasy points per game. However, they may not be who you'd expect. They're also maybe not in the order you'd expect. Josh Allen and Cam Newton in your top 5. Patrick Mahomes and Lamar Jackson barely in the top 10, and Gardner Minshew ahead of Deshaun Watson thus far. What stands out to you the most in our pursuit to capture quarterback glory in fantasy this year?
I would say it starts with some of those names that we didn't expect to be that high up, like Cam Newton and Mr. Murray, although the pundits felt that Kyle Murray was destined to be great and has shown both by his arm and his legs with the Arizona offense. My concern is more towards the fact that there are some veteran quarterbacks that don't seem to be putting up consistent week to week. And two names that come to mind is one that I own, Carson Wentz, where now he's yet to eclipse the 20-point mark. And then I think Drew Brees is kind of hovering around that as well. Tom Brady had an 8-point performance, but I think the week before he had around close to 20. So those three names kind of come to mind where if we don't see any consistency, if you're a fantasy owner, you should be utterly concerned and start looking at the waiver wire to see who could possibly be a backup, especially when bye weeks come around or even sooner. That is going to be something that I'm going to keep my close eye on. I think for Carson Wentz, I'm going to give him a little bit more time, maybe another week, with the fact that that offensive line is still trying to gel together. I know he's got a few injuries on the offensive weapon side, and with Miles Sanders hopefully now fully healthy and back, he had a good showing the first week. Maybe that kind of gives Carson a little bit more weapons to choose from. But if you do not have something of consistency in the quarterback, 20 plus points, it's going to be tough to kind of sustain success through the course of the year.
Yeah, I think occasionally we confuse depth with value in that it's a very deep position, right? Even on waivers right now in a deep league like ours, there's still plenty of viable quarterback candidates that you could select that could generate those weeks. However, even though it's a deep position, it's still a necessary position. It's still a position that requires that you're generating a somewhat close to league average in points to be a sustainably great team, because it's so tough, to your point, when you're generating single digits or even sub 20 in some weeks, and you're going against the 25 plus point weeks that a lot of other folks may have. And that's where I think people get confused. It's not that it's not an important position, because I think a lot of times with draft strategy, there's this feeling like, oh, you can wait on quarterbacks, and you absolutely can. However, if you miss, it's time to pivot, because you cannot necessarily just sit around and wait for your quarterback to hit. There's such a depth there that I think you have to look at other opportunities to ensure that you are getting the points you need per week, even if it's not your first choice that it was on draft night.
Yeah, when Ryan Tannehill is a better play than what you have on the roster, now you know you're in trouble.
That's your pivot point. That's your pivot point. All right, well, speaking of surprises, we'll jump over to potential busts. Obviously, it is too early to start talking about players that have busted. However, we're 2 weeks in, and there is always this need to overreact and this antsiness to determine what we were right or wrong about on draft night. Garcia, as you look at the state of the fantasy community in 2 weeks, is there a player that is currently in that bust zone, hasn't performed where they maybe were determined that they should have been in the first 2 weeks, that you still believe in?
It's a toss-up. I would go with either Austin Eckler of the San Diego Chargers, now the LA Chargers, or Julio Jones, who I think was a second-round pick by Cincinnati. In fact, I think both of those players are on the two-time defending champ roster. My concern with Austin Eckler is the fact that they're not using him what many thought that he would be used as both on the run game, but also in the passing. It seems like right now the Chargers are still trying to identify themselves with a number of things. You know, Keenan Allen certainly got a few more plays and targets last Sunday, but the week before it didn't seem like there was a lot of cohesion between him and Tyrod Taylor. And now there's, of course, questions surrounding their QB situation. While I, as an owner of Jonathan Kelly, the running back, I believe out of UCLA, he's getting more play in that goal line, red zone area. So I for one, am hoping that it kind of stays to that fruition with Austin Eckler's output. But I got to think the Chargers are eventually going to have to open up the game plan a little bit more and use him. And it could be, again, a case of where a lot of teams are kind of holding back some of their star players, as we've seen with all these injuries, because of the fact there was no preseason. There's just a lot of questions in terms of how healthy everyone is, and you're trying to just kind of more take it as a marathon instead of a sprint. So maybe by week 4 or 5, we're going to figure out who really is a bust and then who really is the one that just kind of knew was going to get out of the shell. Another name kind of as a 1B is going to be Julio Jones. I'm really worried about the fact that Matt Ryan's throwing the ball around and it's hardly ever to Julio Jones.
Yeah, they've been spreading it, but Calvin Ridley has been the beneficiary thus far. We've seen that before. Calvin Ridley has started as a wide receiver 1 in the first month of football before and quickly dissipated back to wide receiver 20. So we don't know. And I'll give you a name, and that name is Derrick Henry. Derrick Henry is RB23, I think, right now. He's barely in the top 25. And there is probably some concern for those that drafted him, as most did in the first round, that are interested in whether they're going to get that first-round performance. I think you look at a Derrick Henry, and he's had lulls. Week 3 to 7, I think, last year. He was barely in the top 20. I think it was like RB19. But he was RB3 for the rest of the year. So I don't know that you look at players like Derrick Henry, maybe even to a degree Julio Jones, and you get that concerned because you believe that the ceiling is still there for them. I think you do look at other players, even though this wasn't the question that was originally asked. I think you do look at other players like a Mark Ingram or anyone in the Baltimore running game or a Kenyon Drake, anyone in the Arizona running game. And you look at the way those offenses are built right now and you see the amount of mouths they're feeding, not just in the passing game or in the offense, just in the rushing game. With the running backs that they're working in, as well as the quarterbacks that obviously are a big part of those rushing offenses. And I think you start taking your ceilings down a little bit because without some remarkable touchdown luck, those are tough backfields to have a share in this year, so to speak.
Yeah, I think the one thing with Derrick Henry, though, is it's the body of work really kind of gained a lot of momentum at the end of the season into the playoffs. And to your point, I mean, he's had those lulls. So I think it's still too early to tell on these guys and just say that they're a bust. But it's certainly some warning signs, particularly on the running back side. Like you mentioned, Mark Ingram, another one who, again, Lamar runs that offense and he's got his weapons to his left and his right and Mark Andrews. So some difficult decisions may need to be made in terms of when it comes to starting active players.
Yeah, I mean, the problem here is that we might be a couple of weeks away from knowing, as a fantasy manager, you'd like to get out in front of it, right? So you'd like to be able to know for sure, Kenyon Drake, Mark Ingram, they're not going to be who I thought they were going to be when I drafted them. I'd like to trade them before everybody else finds that out, versus where you could be in a month or 6 weeks from now if it is in fact true, and obviously the value goes down.
It sounds like you have a trade already in the hands with Kenyon Drake. So,
well, who wouldn't want Kenyon Drake after what we've seen?
I didn't. Neither did Cincinnati.
All right, let's move on to OTB, and of course, it's time to panic because it's always time to panic. And there are a few teams that have started 0-2, maybe not necessarily because of anything they've done, just because of some bad luck, or maybe because the performance hasn't been where it needs to be. If you look across the league, historically speaking, being 0-2 is not a death sentence. That said, your probability of making the postseason is certainly lessened than even just being 1-1 at this point. Garcia, who do you look at in the 0-2 club right now that you would bet on as a postseason participant later in the year?
I would go with all aboard the baby bus. This is part of his, I guess, game plan. He starts off slow and then starts picking things up to where he makes that last minute rush, whether he gets into the playoffs or not, and really kind of causes terror for a lot of teams that are fighting for that last playoff spot or those who are trying to fight for seeding. He's got Patrick Mahomes on his roster, so one would think that eventually he's going to start him every week, with the exception last week, probably because he looked at where he thought he had a better matchup with Aaron Rodgers versus the Detroit Lions, or maybe he just thought it was a bye week in facing a Daniel Jones-led roster on sidebar. So my money's on all aboard the baby bus. Some tough losses. I think he'll get his act together when it comes to who's going to start in the quarterback situation. And again, I think you can never go wrong with Pat Mahomes.
Well, I'll give you the waiverman, which maybe is also, it's kind of an obvious answer, but I will tell you this, for those like myself that tend to think they're the beneficiary of all the bad luck, right? It's always happening to us. It's not happening to anyone else. I don't know if I could continue to maintain cognitive function when I put up 125 plus points in back-to-back weeks and I'm sitting there at 0-2. I think maybe he's third in the league right now in total points and is sitting there at 0-2. Plenty of time to course correct, and I don't even know that course correct means anything but get lucky with who you're playing on the other side of the app, so you start generating some wins. Right now, he's got a dominant hold over the fifth playoff spot, the first wild card spot. But I do think that hopefully things start working out for him, and if they don't, what I always think is interesting is at what point does the rest of the league start rooting for him, right? Because we've seen this before. Teams that are crazy good in points but are getting crazy unlucky with wins and losses, they cause this bottleneck in the wild card spot because of our structure that actually is quite irritating to teams trying to break in, because you just want them to get out of it, right? Because your points aren't going to be able to match theirs. They're just super unlucky with wins and losses. There's usually a top 4 team in that mix that's much better, that you hope kind of sinks back down. So it's funny, another week or two with Waverman having some bad luck, and the entire league is going to start rooting for him to start winning some games, because he is going to cause this bottleneck that nobody wants. We're running low on time, so we're going to shift over to the power rankings. Always an exciting thing to talk about, especially early in the season when there's a lot of changeover. Garcia, I'm going to put them on a screen. I'm going to ask you a question, but I'm going to start by explaining them a bit. As you can see, there was some movement this week. Wristbands, Shipwreck, greatest show on paper, among the biggest movers in a positive direction. Sidebar, among the biggest movers in a negative direction. As you look across the power rankings, I'm sure you've got opinions. What do you agree with? What do you disagree with going into week 3?
I have no opinion, because I know that it's still too early to tell, and I'm not surprised where you position yourself, where you kind of hang around in that middle of the group and drop me even further down the ladder. I think of those who are in the top, I think they have some injuries that just recently hit their rosters. So talk to me in week 4, 5, 6, when the power rankings actually mean something. But right now, if you're undefeated, you should be at the top of the list, unlike yourself. And I think you're just trying to mitigate the issues of, fan favorite when it comes to the league commissioner's office.
Look, I'll say this, because this is also a platform by which I can defend how the power rankings are built, because obviously there's always this intent that there's some media bias in it, and as much as there are not data scientists employed at the league office, I will say that there is math involved in these. People don't believe me when I say it, and I will say that the math is maybe not the most sophisticated, but it does lessen the consequence of wins and losses early in the season, right? So you see a Waverman up there. I'm going to put it up again in a second. You see Waverman up there right now in the 3 spot, and you say, well, he's 0-2. Because we're so early in the season and he's still top 3 in points, there is a belief that luck will just even out for this squad, and they'll end up being better down the stretch in terms of, remember, this is just an analysis of playoff potential, right? But if Waverman continues to lose, even regardless of points, as we get later into the season, your win-loss record is going to weight more heavily in where you are in the power rankings. So there's a million other things that we talk about, depth and injuries. So as the example here, you see Regulators squeezing just ahead of Gronk TDs, even though Gronk TDs has, I think, like one more point. But Gronk TDs just lost their first-round draft pick for the season, right? Regulators had an injury to their first-round pick, too. We expect that he'll come back. So I think as you look at and trying to explain a little bit how these power rankings work, they're part what we're doing right now, part present sense, but they're also a projection of where we think these teams will be.
I guess if I'm Alex Shipman, the Shipwreck, I'm wondering how I'm below you when it comes to, and wristbands for that matter, and an 0-2 team. So if anybody needs to be upset about this, it's Shipwreck.
Now, how about greatest show on paper? Granted, they're not 2-0, but they're 1-1. I think they have more points than all the teams you just mentioned. Maybe not wristbands. I'd have to look back at it. But, everyone's going to have quarrels with this, I think.
Yeah, I guess I'll say this in rebuttal to where greatest show on paper is he has a bunch of Cleveland Browns on his roster. That's not going to be successful in the long run.
I don't know if he has more than one, but I understand what you're
let me look, because I've got it right here. Well, he's got Nick Chubb. So he has more. He has one, which is way too many.
Yeah. Well, we'll see, since Regulators has the second half of that timeshare, and Kareem Hunt, who also had a game on Thursday night. We'll see if any of this is sustainable. That's what we don't know yet. Some of the things we think will continue to happen, we never learn from our mistakes, because if we looked at this point last year, we'll learn quickly that, in fact, after 2 weeks, nothing that we thought was going to be true for the rest of the year ends up being true. So, anyway, appreciate again. This is Garcia on the West Coast, Sidebar out on the East Coast. It'll be a busy waiver wire. We expect it to be. So best of luck in your pursuits for your free agent acquisition budgets, and we will see you again next week.